She was just 15 years old, young, vibrant, and filled with dreams that stretched far beyond the small city of Kenosha, Wisconsin. Kaylie Juga was like many other teenage girls her age. She was passionate, expressive, and deeply connected to her family and friends. She attended Bradford High School, where she quickly became known not only for her beauty and charm but for her artistic talents, particularly her love for singing and dancing. Her parents described her as someone who brought light into every room she entered, and her teachers often spoke of her discipline and ambition. Kaylie had clear goals. She wanted to pursue a career in the entertainment industry, perhaps as a performer or an artist. Her future, by all accounts, looked bright and full of promise. In 2018, Kaylie entered into a relationship that would ultimately change the course of her life. She met Martice Fuller, a student in the same high school, who was a year older than her. Martice had a different kind of reputation among his peers. While some saw him as confident and athletic, others noticed traits that suggested volatility. Still, at first glance, he appeared charming. He was involved in sports, had a commanding presence, and carried himself with confidence. For a young girl experiencing her first serious relationship, Martice likely appeared exciting, mature, and emotionally intense. Their relationship progressed quickly, as many teenage romances do. The early days were filled with affection, texting each other constantly, sitting together at lunch, exchanging gifts, and posting affectionate messages on social media. To many of their classmates, it looked like a normal young love story. Friends reported that Kaylie seemed happier, often talking about Martice with enthusiasm and pride. She appeared to enjoy the attention and care that he initially provided. It was the kind of relationship that many teens idealize: romantic, intense, and seemingly full of connection. However, the dynamic between Kaylie and Martice began to shift after a few months. Beneath the surface of their public relationship, Martice began to exhibit behaviors that were concerning but not always easy for a teenager to identify as warning signs. He reportedly became controlling, frequently asking Kaylie where she was, who she was speaking to, and what she was doing. These behaviors were often disguised as concern or love, which made them harder for Kaylie to recognize as possessive or toxic. Over time, Martice's jealousy grew. He did not like it when Kaylie spent time with friends, especially male friends, and he reportedly became irritated or angry when she made independent decisions without involving him. Some of Kaylie's friends noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She became more withdrawn from her social circle, less available to hang out, and quieter about her personal life. While she may have tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, those close to her began to sense that something wasn't right. But at such a young age, many teenagers do not have the tools to recognize or respond to emotionally manipulative behavior. Moreover, Kaylie, being kind-hearted and trusting, may have believed she could help Martice or that his actions were temporary signs of emotional insecurity. It is also important to consider the broader context in which this relationship unfolded. Teenage dating violence is a subject that is often overlooked or minimized. Adolescents are frequently unequipped to distinguish between healthy and unhealthy relationship dynamics, and schools or families may not always be prepared to intervene until a situation escalates. In Kaylie's case, there were early signs that should have raised alarms, but they were either unnoticed or not acted upon in time. Whether due to inexperience, fear of social backlash, or a desire to maintain the relationship, Kaylie continued to be involved with Martice, even as his behavior became increasingly intense. Martice's possessiveness began to escalate beyond emotional control. Reports later revealed that he exhibited threatening behaviors, such as monitoring her activities closely and expressing anger over trivial matters. There were even instances where Kaylie seemed uncomfortable or anxious around him. Still, like many young individuals caught in emotionally manipulative relationships, she may have minimized these feelings or believed things would eventually improve. It is not uncommon for young victims of toxic relationships to feel trapped, ashamed, or simply confused about how to proceed. Eventually, Kaylie began to pull away from Martice. Whether it was because she recognized the toxicity in their relationship or due to outside influence from her concerned family and friends, she made efforts to distance herself. However, this decision would only intensify Martice's emotional instability. For someone like him, controlling, jealous, and emotionally volatile, the idea of losing control over Kaylie was not acceptable. This is often a dangerous phase in abusive relationships, when the victim attempts to break free, and the abuser responds with heightened aggression or threats. At this stage, the line between affection and obsession had completely eroded. What began as a typical teenage romance had become a dangerous power imbalance. Kaylie was no longer just a girlfriend in Martice's eyes, she was someone he needed to possess, to control, and ultimately, someone he couldn't allow to leave him. This tragic story, which began with smiles in the school hallway and affectionate texts exchanged between classes, would eventually spiral into one of the most heartbreaking crimes in Kenosha's recent history. A girl filled with potential, caught in a web of manipulation and danger she couldn't fully understand, stood unknowingly at the edge of a tragedy that would leave a permanent scar on her family, her community, and the nation. At first glance, the relationship between Kaylie Juga and Martice Fuller seemed like any other teenage romance, intense, emotional, and all-consuming. But as the months passed, what looked like love began to unravel into something far more dangerous. Behind the smiles and public affection, troubling patterns were quietly taking root. Subtle red flags, often ignored or misunderstood in the early stages, began to appear more frequently, and they painted the chilling picture of a relationship spiraling into darkness. Martice's behavior shifted from affectionate to possessive. He became increasingly jealous of Kaylie's interactions with others, especially with male classmates. He often questioned where she was, who she was texting, and why she didn't respond to his messages immediately. What might have seemed like harmless insecurity was actually the start of something more insidious: emotional control. If Kaylie didn't reply fast enough, Martice would lash out. If she spent time with friends without him, he'd accuse her of betrayal. Slowly but surely, his words and actions began to chip away at her independence. According to friends and schoolmates, Kaylie started withdrawing from people she used to be close to. She stopped participating in social events, became more reserved, and seemed to carry an underlying anxiety in her everyday demeanor. When asked about Martice, she'd often downplay the problems. That's the dangerous thing about toxic relationships, especially for young victims. They don't always recognize the abuse because it doesn't start with physical violence. It starts with manipulation, control, and fear masked as love. Martice was also reported to have a violent temper. There were moments where his anger escalated quickly over minor disagreements. Teachers and staff at Bradford High School were aware of confrontations between the two, and at least one instance of violence had been reported. Eventually, school authorities took disciplinary action against Martice, including removing him from school for a period of time. But even that wasn't enough to stop him from trying to maintain control over Kaylie. Despite warnings from friends, and even her own growing discomfort, Kaylie struggled to break free. Like many victims of emotional abuse, she may have felt trapped between fear and confusion, unsure if she was overreacting or if she had a responsibility to fix the boy she once cared for. Teenagers often lack the emotional tools and support systems to process complex relationships, and this can lead them to stay in situations that feel both painful and inescapable. Behind closed doors, the relationship became a battlefield of manipulation, threats, and emotional dependency. Martice's obsession grew darker. He began making threatening remarks, issuing ultimatums, and creating a world where Kaylie felt suffocated by his presence but terrified to leave him. His love was no longer nurturing, it was possessive. It was dangerous. Those closest to Kaylie, her parents, especially her mother, Lisa, started noticing the emotional toll. They tried to intervene, to guide her away from the toxic connection. But breaking away from an obsessive partner is never easy, especially for someone so young. Kaylie was trying to navigate love, fear, loyalty, and pressure, all at once. And all while attending school, balancing her dreams, and holding on to some sense of normalcy. By this point, it wasn't just young love anymore, it was obsession. And it was building toward a tragic breaking point. What started as a teenage romance was now a ticking time bomb, with Kaylie caught in the middle. And despite the warnings, the red flags, and the growing tension, no one could have predicted just how devastating the fallout would be. After months of emotional manipulation, possessive behavior, and mounting fear, Kaylie Juga finally found the strength to step away. She decided to end her relationship with Martice Fuller, a choice that was brave, necessary, and heartbreakingly dangerous. For Kaylie, breaking up wasn't just about walking away from a toxic relationship. It was about reclaiming her freedom, her voice, and her sense of self. But for Martice, it was the ultimate betrayal, an insult that shattered his illusion of control. And in his mind, if he couldn't have her, no one could. The breakup marked a turning point, a moment when obsession began transforming into something darker and far more volatile. After Kaylie ended the relationship, Martice didn't let go. Instead, he grew more aggressive, more unhinged, and more determined to keep Kaylie within his grasp, whether she wanted to be there or not. He began stalking her online, monitoring her social media posts, and showing up in places he knew she would be. His presence was no longer romantic, it was threatening. Those around Kaylie noticed that the fear in her eyes was no longer subtle. She became increasingly anxious, and her family grew more protective. Her mother, Lisa Juga, had long been concerned about Martice's behavior, and now her instincts told her that something was deeply wrong. She took steps to create distance, including filing a restraining order and notifying school officials about the situation. The family tried to build a wall between Kaylie and her former boyfriend, but Martice was relentless. What made the situation even more dangerous was that Martice believed Kaylie had moved on. He couldn't handle the idea of her living her life without him, possibly seeing someone new or simply being happy on her own. In his twisted perception, her independence was a threat, not a right. The idea that Kaylie was slipping out of his control pushed him further into a mindset driven by revenge and rage. In the days following the breakup, Martice's behavior escalated beyond just emotional harassment. He began making threatening comments, some in person, others online. It became clear to those around him that he was not only angry but mentally spiraling. He reportedly made chilling statements to peers, hinting at violence and expressing fantasies of retribution. His obsession was no longer just a private torment, it was seeping into his public behavior. And while people noticed, few could fully grasp how close he was to acting on his threats. Kaylie, in the meantime, tried to continue with her life. She focused on her music, her schoolwork, and spending time with her family. She smiled for photos, laughed with her little sister, and tried to regain a sense of peace. But behind that brave face, she likely lived in a constant state of fear, wondering when, not if, Martice would strike again. The heartbreak of this chapter lies in how familiar it is to so many. Teenage girls all over the world experience breakups with emotionally unstable partners. They try to move on, rebuild, and grow, never imagining that leaving someone could cost them their life. But Kaylie was not dealing with a typical ex-boyfriend, she was dealing with someone who had already crossed the line into obsession. And Martice Fuller was about to make a decision that would devastate an entire community. May 9, 2019. A day that began like any other in Kenosha, Wisconsin, but would soon be etched into the town's memory forever. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Kaylie Juga had returned home from school. The atmosphere in her family home was typical, safe, warm, familiar. She was surrounded by people who loved her, who had tried everything in their power to protect her from the threat they knew was lurking just beyond the door. But no one could have predicted how quickly that threat would turn into tragedy. Sometime after school hours, Martice Fuller, just 15 years old at the time, broke into the Juga family home. It wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was calculated. He had armed himself and made the conscious decision to go to the place Kaylie felt safest, with one intent, to take control, to punish, and ultimately, to destroy. The very same boy Kaylie once trusted, laughed with, and loved, was now trespassing into her world as a predator. As Kaylie sat in her room, Martice found her. What exactly was said in those final moments, no one knows. But what followed was nothing short of horrifying. Martice pulled out a firearm and shot Kaylie multiple times. The bullets tore through her young body, leaving no chance for survival. The girl who once dreamed of dancing on stage, who had only just begun her life, was mercilessly gunned down in her own home. But the violence didn't stop there. Kaylie's mother, Lisa Juga, heard the commotion and rushed in. In a desperate attempt to protect her daughter or confront the shooter, she too was shot, injured but miraculously not killed. The house, once filled with love and laughter, became a crime scene. Blood on the floor. A mother screaming. A daughter lifeless. Emergency services responded quickly, but for Kaylie, it was too late. Paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. The news spread rapidly, first to her school, then across the community. Teachers wept. Students gathered in silence. Kenosha had lost one of its brightest young lights, and in the cruelest, most senseless way imaginable. Martice fled the scene immediately. A manhunt followed, with law enforcement working around the clock to locate him. The fear that gripped the town was overwhelming. No one knew where he would go next, or what he was capable of doing. For a period of time, Kenosha wasn't just grieving, it was holding its breath in terror. The emotional weight of that day is hard to put into words. The Juga family had done everything right. They had set boundaries, filed protective orders, warned school officials, and tried to shield their daughter from danger. But the system had failed. And now, their daughter was gone, stolen from them in an act of cold-blooded violence, committed by someone who once claimed to love her. May 9th didn't just mark the end of Kaylie's life. It shattered a family. It scarred a community. And it exposed the terrifying reality of how quickly obsession can turn fatal when warning signs are ignored or dismissed. This wasn't just a murder. It was a wake-up call. One that came far too late. Following the horrifying events of May 9, 2019, the city of Kenosha was in shock, but also in fear. Martice Fuller, the teen now accused of brutally murdering Kaylie Juga and shooting her mother, was on the run. The manhunt stretched across neighborhoods, with helicopters hovering overhead and police canvassing the area in search of a teenager who had committed an adult crime. Parents kept their children indoors. Schools heightened security. No one felt safe until Martice was found. Within hours, law enforcement received a tip. Martice had fled to a friend's house, where he was attempting to hide. Armed officers moved in, and he was taken into custody without incident. The boy who had once held Kaylie's hand in the hallways of Bradford High was now in handcuffs, accused of executing one of the most senseless and calculated murders in recent local history. The arrest marked a turning point, but it didn't ease the grief. It only began the long, painful process of justice. From the moment Martice was taken in, investigators began piecing together the details. What they uncovered was chilling, evidence that he had planned the attack, stolen the firearm used in the crime, and had a history of violent threats toward Kaylie leading up to the murder. His digital footprint, messages, searches, and social media behavior painted the profile of a teen consumed by rage and rejection. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated. The legal process moved quickly. Martice was charged as an adult with first-degree intentional homicide, attempted homicide, and armed burglary. The community watched closely as the case unfolded, torn between their shock that someone so young could commit such a brutal act, and their desire to see justice served. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Family members of both the victim and the accused sat just feet apart, divided by grief, guilt, and unimaginable loss. During the trial, the prosecution laid out a damning case. Witnesses described Martice's escalating behavior, his obsession with Kaylie, and his threats. Forensic experts detailed how the bullet wounds confirmed a deliberate intent to kill. Kaylie's mother, Lisa Juga, who had survived the shooting, took the stand to give the most heartbreaking testimony of all. She described the moment she found her daughter lying motionless, the sound of the gunfire, and the pain of knowing she couldn't save her. Her voice trembled, but her words cut like a blade through the silence of the courtroom. Martice's defense team tried to argue diminished responsibility, pointing to his age, his troubled upbringing, and emotional instability. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through the attempts to minimize the horror of his actions. After a tense deliberation, the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts. Martice Fuller was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 60 years. There were no cheers in the courtroom. No sense of victory. Only tears and silence. The conviction brought a measure of justice, but not closure. Nothing could bring Kaylie back. No sentence could undo the trauma inflicted on her family. And no courtroom ruling could erase the image of a beautiful young girl with her entire future ahead of her, stolen by someone who once claimed to love her. Martice's sentencing served as a reminder that justice, while necessary, can never fully heal the wounds left by violence. For the Juga family, every birthday, every holiday, and every quiet moment in their home is a painful reminder of the daughter and sister they lost. And for the community of Kenosha, the trial ended with a question that still lingers: how could this have happened? The trial was over. The sentence was delivered. But the story didn't end there, because tragedies like this don't just fade with time. For the Juga family, life would never return to what it once was. Their home, once filled with laughter, dance rehearsals, and music, had become a haunting reminder of what they had lost. Kaylie's room remained frozen in time, her posters still on the wall, her clothes folded in drawers, and her voice now only a memory preserved in home videos and voicemail recordings. The emptiness was unbearable. For Lisa and Jeff Juga, no parent should ever have to bury their child, especially not one taken so violently, so young, and so senselessly. But the grief didn't stop at the Juga family's front door. The entire Kenosha community was shaken to its core. Bradford High School, once just a typical American high school filled with sports, exams, and dances, was now the center of a tragic crime story. Students were heartbroken, teachers devastated. Classrooms sat in silence. Desks were empty. There was no playbook for how to cope with something like this. Counseling services were brought in. Vigils were held. And flowers, letters, and candles flooded the front steps of the school and the Juga home. Kaylie's story forced difficult conversations into the public space, about teen dating violence, emotional abuse, stalking, and how quickly things can escalate when early warning signs are ignored or misunderstood. People began to ask uncomfortable but necessary questions: how do we protect our kids when love turns toxic? How can schools, families, and the legal system work together before it's too late? In the wake of her death, Kaylie's family made it their mission to honor her memory by raising awareness. They didn't want their daughter to just be another statistic. Her story became a rallying cry, a call to action. They spoke publicly, shared her story with media outlets, and pushed for change in how teen relationships are discussed and handled in schools and communities. Their hope was that no other family would have to endure the pain they lived with every single day. In honor of Kaylie's legacy, scholarships were established in her name, and local organizations began implementing programs around teen relationship education. Her face, once a symbol of youth and promise, now stood for something even greater, a reminder that silence can be deadly, and that love should never hurt. Still, nothing could erase the pain. Every May, when the anniversary of her death arrives, Kenosha falls quiet again. Candles are lit. Balloons are released. And her name is spoken aloud by classmates, family members, and friends who refuse to forget her. Kaylie Juga wasn't just a victim, she was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a bright soul whose light was stolen too soon. Her story lives on, not only as a tragedy but as a powerful warning. A reminder that obsession is not love, that control is not care, and that recognizing the signs early could be the difference between life and death. Kaylie's legacy is now etched into the hearts of everyone who hears her story. And for those left behind, the mission is clear: to speak up, to protect, and to make sure her death was not in vain.